Já tá ao vivo, Israel. Não sei se ele me ouviu, já tá ao vivo, tá?
Ô, e aí, moçada, tudo bom? É que pra quem não sabe, eu sempre vou ao banheiro antes das lives, porque a minha bexiga é desse tamanho,
Também.
né? E aí né? Enfim.
Você tá ouvindo? Alguém abriu o YouTube aí?
Eu abri o YouTube, mas eu já botei o som pra baixo. É. Boa noite pra Rúbia.
Oi, Rúbia.
Oi, Rúbia.
Tu conhece ela, Bruno? Eu não sei quem.
Eu acho que ela tava no festival agora, não é, Matheus? Ou não sei. Se não for, ela pode me dizer também.
Tenho nada a opinar.
O Matheus disse que ele ia estar sério hoje. Olha só como é que ele já tá agora.
Ele tava?
Tô sério.
Ah, é?
Mas eu tô sério.
Eu tava nem falando comigo. Boa noite, pessoal. Quem estiver entrando, manda boa noite aí pra gente. Pra gente ver vocês.
Boa noite, Silvia, se estiver aí.
Cadê a Silvia?
Eu esqueci de falar pra ela. Vou mandar o link pra eles aqui. Peraí.
Boa noite, Quarteto Melo, se estiver entrando também.
Cadê a tia Silvia?
Cadê teus pais, Israel?
Cadê o Quarteto Melo? Também.
Cadê?
Boa noite, Caio.
Boa noite pro Caíto.
Ó,
o Matheus falou Caito. Tipo, eu vi o Matheus mudando a sílaba no meio enquanto ele falava, tá ligado? Ele foi falar Caito, daí ele mudou pra Caíto na hora, foi muito bom. Cadê a Sônia?
É verdade!
Sônia, cadê você?
É que a gente nunca tinha feito live no domingo, né? As pessoas não estão acostumadas com isso.
Ah, mas ela curtiu as nossas postagens, então ela deve entrar. Tardinho.
Verdade, essa é a primeira live do domingo, né?
Isso.
Boa noite pro Leonardo aí, que é brother da Bruna.
Boa noite, Leonardo.
O Roger... Aí, Sônia! Sônia chegou!
É que pra mim chega depois as mensagens.
A gente só pode chamar o convidado depois que a Sônia chega. Senão a gente não pode chamar o convidado ainda.
Isso aí.
Essa é a regra.
Boa, Sônia.
Ouvi que a Sônia tá em Baton Rouge. Eu quase fui pra lá pra fazer o doutorado. Baton Rouge é Louisiana, que é onde fica a Louisiana State. Onde o Elias Goldstein dava aula.
Sim.
É uma boa universidade. É bom porque fica 45 minutos de Nova Orleans, então é tipo sonho.
Olha, quase achei que era seu parente, Israel.
Giovanni
Melo.
Não, Giovanni Melo. Não, Giovanni Melo não é o aluno do Kubala, aquele?
É?
Ah, é? Não sei.
Giovanni, é tu que é o aluno do Kubala? Responde aí.
Pois é.
Se não me engano, ele tá... se for quem eu tô pensando, eu conheci ele... O Leonardo falou que sim. Eu conheci ele em Poços, 2017.
Nossa, as mensagens não vieram ainda, cara.
E ele tava tocando... Ele tava tocando Suite 2.
Ele confirmou, né?
Ele respondeu.
Eu lembro dele tocar o prelúdio da Suite 2 pro Bundle. Era isso aí. É isso aí, ó, viu?
Que legal.
Gente, antes de tudo, recadinho, né?
Recado do Matheus, vai lá, Matheus.
Curtir, compartilhar, se inscrever no canal. Lembre de curtir, se inscrever no nosso canal. E, além disso, faça suas perguntas aí no YouTube, no chat.
Podem mandar as perguntas já que a gente fica de olho, ou durante a live, né? Vão mandando por aqui.
Acho que Israel ficou surpreso, eu falei bem quietinho.
Mas falando sério, eu gosto mais quando tu... Não é que é zoeira, mas aquela energia que tu tem, assim, quando tu... Vamos pro canal, se inscreva.
Eu gosto porque tá frio. É porque tá frio e hoje é live de gringos, lembra?
Ah, é. Ô, tá frio aí?
Tá.
Tá. Aqui tá
Gente, eu nem fui pra rua hoje ainda. Tipo, são 5 horas da tarde que eu nem fui. Mas tá, segundo um negócio que tá 33 graus lá fora.
em casa.
Mas tem comida, pelo menos, em casa.
Sim, por isso que eu não saí. Tem comida em casa porque o cara vai sair, né? É quarentena. Não, mas aqui em Lubbock não dá pra ficar saindo assim, né, a gente? Ó, pra quem não sabe, a gente tá no New York Times. A gente saiu no New York Times essa semana porque.
Gente,
Não, aqui na cidade, porque as pessoas.
parece que é a gente, nós, né? Os tribais.
Não, aqui em Lubbock, porque as pessoas estão se reunindo nos lugares, tal, nos restaurantes, e os casos estão tendo, tipo, mais de 100 por dia. Texas é o Texas, né, gurizada? Enfim, Bruna, quando tu tá no controle aí.
Vamos parar de enrolar e chamar ele logo pra. Tu quer dar um recado em inglês ainda, Matheus, ou não? Matheus ou Israel?
Israel.
Não.
Mas não tem ninguém em inglês aí. Não tem ninguém em inglês ainda. Aí é meio difícil,
Tem
né?
alguém que fala inglês assistindo? Fala assim.
Não.
Não, que tem gente que fala inglês assistindo, tem, só não sei se tem gente que só fala inglês, né?
Perguntei. Tô brincando.
Não.
Tá.
E a Vivi, como tá? Antes de ele entrar, como tá a Vivi? Tá dormindo? Só pra saber.
A Vivi tá dormindo. Ela tava super carente hoje, no início da tarde, sempre que eu tô almoçando, ela vem e começa a miar. E aí, tipo, tem que parar tudo e ir ali fazer carinho nela. Daí ela deita de barriga pra cima e fica miando sem parar. E aí, tipo, nisso dá um tempão, daí eu volto, minha comida tá fria. E é assim a vida. Não,
Obrigado.
mas ela tá bem, ela tá bem. Boa noite pro Ulisses. Deu. Boa noite pro Ulisses primeiro. Aham.
Não chegou também, não vale isso.
Pois é.
A tua internet ser ruim e os comentários chegarem primeiro pra ti.
Mas tu tá olhando os comentários pelo StreamYard ou tu tá com o YouTube aberto em algum lugar?
Eu olho pelo StreamYard.
Não, no StreamYard chega bem depois no StreamYard. Chega bem
Ulisses,
depois.
não se esqueça.
Isso.
Ulisses, não se preocupe, vai ter outra live. E vai ser os 3. Vai ser 6. Emerson, você e Camila. Vai ser muita conversa.
É uma live que vai começar às 3 horas da tarde. Pra ter certeza que a gente cobre todo o material, né?
Ô, gente, vamos começar, porque já deu bastante tempo.
Vamos nessa.
Então vamos chamar nosso convidado de hoje, Roger Myers. Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm great, and you all?
Fine, thanks.
We're fine.
Yeah. So I just want to say thank you for being here with us today. And so to start, we want to ask you about your background as a musician. So if you can tell us a little bit, how did you start with studying music and also with the viola?
Yes, well, I have a longer story than some. I was born in Australia, and my mother was a concert pianist, a very fine one. And when I was young, she tried me on the piano, and I didn't seem to be interested. But we had a family violin. Her mother was a violinist. My mother had, amongst other things, she had an Italian ancestry, and her mother, her last name was Giovanelli, she was a violinist, and we had her violin in our home, and so she tried me on that violin, and I seemed to be very interested in it. And so I ultimately started lessons on the violin. I was interested in everything in the arts. I studied acting, and I also studied dance when I was younger, but it was the violin that won out. And I ended up going to a very fine high school, which was very musical. And I got involved with a lot of activities at the school including their orchestra program and chamber music. But I also sang, and that school was the school that the Australian Opera went to get all their boy sopranos. And so at the age of 12, I auditioned and won a place to be a boy soprano with the Australian Opera. And I kept winning auditions for 3 more years until my voice changed. And so my first professional job was at the age of 12, singing with the Australian Opera. And I sang 3, as I said, subsequent productions with the Australian Opera until the age of 14, when my voice changed. And I got the chance to sing with the really great Australian soprano, one of the great sopranos of the 20th century. Her name was Joan Sutherland. So if you don't know that name, well worth looking up. She was, to this day, they think that was one of the greatest voices, female voices of the 20th century. So to be up really next to that and singing in the Sydney Opera House, which at that point in time was still a fairly new building, it was really very thrilling for a 12-year-old. And I think it was at that point that I decided that I didn't know where I would be in music, but I was going to be in music because it was so instructive. I mean, to be with one of the greatest opera singers of all time and in one of the most fantastic buildings of the period, it was exciting beyond belief. I ended up, of course, studying the viola. I changed to the viola when I was 17 after being at a music festival where I was a concert master, but I was asked to play principal second violin in another orchestra for a few students who wanted to practice conducting. And so I hadn't played second violin for a long time, and I found it very fascinating. I sort of enjoyed not being the absolute highest part. And so I wondered if I liked that, whether I might think about looking at playing a viola. Now, I went home to my mother from this music festival. As I said, I was a concert master at this festival, so I felt pretty good about what I was doing on violin. And then I said to my mother, you know, this is the experience another experience I had. And she said, well, why don't you try the viola? She said, you know, you've always liked chamber music. You've always loved being part of a bigger picture. Why don't you? I've always thought that might be a better thing. Plus, I was getting tall and my arms were getting long. And so she brought a viola home from the local violin shop and I picked it up. I came home from school one afternoon. It was, for Brazilians, you'd understand this, it was in February. So it was the beginning of the school year. And I picked up the viola. My mother had bought Solobach, and I learnt the first prelude. I found out how to learn the clef at sight by thinking in violin third position when you're in viola first position. And I was able to play pretty much immediately. As long as I didn't shift. When I shifted, I had to work it out, but it got me playing really quickly. And because I had a musical family, my father also played piano pretty well, though at that point he was doing other things for a career. And they both looked at each other and said, you know, there's something here. You've got something here. So I went to my violin lesson that Saturday with my violin teacher and pulled my viola out and played the same thing for him. And he said, you're a violist. He said, you've got something. You've got a message. This works for you, and physically it works for you, and tonally it works for you. Now, fortunately, he was originally concertmaster of the Boston Symphony. He's Australian born, but he studied with Ivan Galamian at Juilliard. And so he also took a summer of viola study at Banff with the great William Primrose, you know, the greatest. And so he had a very good ability to help me convert to the viola. And then within about a month of that process, the Australian String Teachers Association, which we call AUSTA, they had their annual convention, and they brought 3 or 4 big string players from around the world, including Donald McInnes, who was a former student of William Primrose. Now, my orchestra director at high school, she was the president of the Australian String Teachers Association. So she said, "You must take a lesson with this man. You know, he's in the Primrose tradition, the greatest tradition. You must take it." So I did. And he said really nice things. He said, "You're incredibly gifted on the viola. Did I know that?" And I said, "Well, no." I said, "I've been on it 1 month." And he said, "Well, you really are, and you need to come study with me." Well, long story, I ended up going to undergrad in Sydney for 2 years. And then I got a scholarship with my string quartet to study in the United States. And then after that year was over, I took him up and started my studies with him at the University of Southern California. So everything from that moment changed. If I hadn't have had some of these experiences that I told you about, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now and sitting here in the United States. But, you know, McInnes he's retired now, but one of the really great teachers and one of the really great players of his time. And he carried the Primrose tradition. And so I went to University of Southern California, where Heifetz, Primrose, and the great cellist Piotr Gorski taught. And of course, Arnold Schoenberg, the great 20th century composer, was also a faculty member. So there was an immense tradition there of string playing and of just music making. And when I was there, the great cellist Lynn Harrell, who just passed away recently, he was on the faculty. And before I finished my studies there, I had played chamber music with him publicly on a number of occasions. So the interesting story, I think, that I tell my own students from my own story is, and before I left Australia, I became a member of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. So I came to this country in a string quartet that was an exceptional string quartet. That didn't work out. I started my career as a musician in opera. I had beginnings of a symphonic career that mattered in Australia. When I came to America, I ended up playing with the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, the LA Opera, Santa Barbara Symphony. I did so a lot of symphonic playing also. And ultimately, when I graduated from university with my master's degree, I did my bachelor's and master's with Mr. McInnes. I won my job here at the University of Texas. And I tell my students I probably wouldn't have won it at the age I was, because I was 26. I wouldn't have won it had I not had all those experiences in the beginning, you know, layer upon layer of different musical experiences to call upon. So I always say to my students, you know, you think you're waiting for your career to begin, but in fact, it's already begun. Don't wait. You're in it now. Your career is already happening. Build it up right now. Start building from the beginning. Start adding experiences that will make you somebody employable by the time you graduate, whenever that is. So that's a brief rundown of my story.
That's awesome. Wait, did you get the Texas University of Texas University job when you were 26?
Mm-hmm.
That's the job you got?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's insane. That's just like insane to get a job like that. Well, especially here in the States. Anyways, that's all. Where in Australia are you?
I'm originally from Sydney, which is the biggest city.
Got it.
You got to remember, jobs. You never know with jobs when your lucky moment will come. It could be earlier, it could be later. There are many reasons why jobs come your way or don't. But I think the other thing you have to know about jobs is that they wanted somebody young at the University of Texas because they had had somebody for many, many years who had become unproductive. And I don't think they felt they had the funds to hire somebody with a big reputation. So that's what we call good luck. Now, that said, I had to beat out everyone else. So, that's also where it comes down to not just good luck, but preparation. But yes, I also feel that the school that I'm at now was a very important university, but I don't think it was as important a school of music as it is now. But it is now a very important school of music. So I've had the other part of my career that I think is untalked about, but really something I think is important for young people to hear today, is that I was not only asked upon to build a viola area because that's what I was meant to do, but I was increasingly being asked to help build a school of music, not because it only fell upon me to do, but because at the time there were a lot of older faculty, and there was knowledge that sooner than later there would start to be retirements, and they were going to ask the younger faculty to sit on the search committees that would then allow them to find the next generation of artist and teacher. And so every time you hired a new person to the faculty, you got one more person who was, relatively speaking, thinking like you were. And as you had one more person, you had one more person who would serve with you on a search committee to hire yet another person who was more or less of your thinking. And when I say more or less, I mean not completely, but contemporaneously thought like you did. And this happened for me. This happened continuously for about 15 years. That I was on search committees again and again and again and again and again. And what I did not expect when I got this job was that would be a sort of a sub portfolio, that I would be asked to become a helper in the building of the school. That was thrilling. It was also grueling. It was difficult, and it was a lot of hardship, because these things are never easy. They're never easy because a lot of people have opinions. And one of the problems was I was being entrusted with these duties, but then I've also had generation gaps where people doubted that you knew what you were doing. So I feel that I've had a sub-career in administration, and subsequently I was elected head of strings, in which capacity I served for 10 years. So I do feel that another part of my career, quite apart from being a teacher and also pursuing solo playing, was also sort of a covert, if not overt, college administrator. And that's another part of my career that you wouldn't know about unless I told you, but it was something that I had to go through. And it's something that's actually been, as I said, full of difficulties and hardships, but also very rewarding at the end of the day. Very rewarding.
That's awesome. Wow. So we really appreciate the fact that you agreed to demonstrate some things for us with your viola. And we have a few questions to ask you.
Sure.
And I wanted to just start by something that is, very simple. But I wanted to know, how do you think about bow distribution? Because I know that you have some interesting things to talk about that.
Well, I will start by saying that the school of playing that I essentially associate myself with is the school of playing what we call the Franco-Belgian school, if you're a violinist. And it started when my first violin teacher, she was British. And towards the end of her life, I asked her, who was your great influence? And she said, well, you won't know who he is. He was British born, but he was a student of Eugene Isay. And so his name was Dennis East, and he was my great influence. So I come from the tradition of Eugene Isay. Well, that struck me because when I studied with Mr. McInnes, he studied with William Primrose, and William Primrose studied with Eugene Isay. So my first violin teacher and my last viola teacher were both students of Eugene Isay. And Eugene Isay was known for his superior bow technique, amongst many other great things. But he was renowned for his bow technique, and there's a big exercise that he would write out on a photograph, an autograph, and it was a bowing etude. And Primrose Heifetz, who, as I say, was a very close associate of Primrose at University of Southern California, Heifetz was asked, who has the best bow technique of anyone you have worked with? And he said, William Primrose, better than my own. And what happened was that Isay was a giant of a man and had a very rounded hand. And if you look into the pictures of his bow hand, it's very around the bow, very square, I would call it. Not leany like the Russian school, or fingery like the German, now relatively not seen German school, but very flat. And that's good for violin playing, but it turns out that that's the bow hold that is so stunning for viola playing, because every finger is in contact with the stick, and each finger imparts its own weight to the bow. And the middle fingers go over the bow further than they would on a violin. So they more as if you're playing the cello. And so it is fortunate that Primrose went to Isay, and then when Isay when he heard Primrose playing on the viola, he said, "You got," again, like was told to me, "You got something for the viola." But you got to remember that Isay's teacher was Henri Vieuxtemps, and Vieuxtemps also wrote a number of very important viola pieces, and Vieuxtemps played the viola, and they say well. So viola was part of the Franco-Belgian tradition as given to Isay by Vieuxtemps. And so it's very fortunate and almost uncanny that Primrose ended up as a student on violin originally of Isay. So Primrose was able to translate those lessons and those techniques from his master to when he went to the viola. And so bow technique is a very important part of, I think, viola playing in general, but also of the Primrose school. And it was imparted to me through Donald McInnes. Now, what's amazing is when you see a picture, for instance, of my bow hand, and then you see a picture of my teacher's bow hand, and you see a picture of his teacher's bow hand, that is Primrose, and you see a picture of Isay's bow hand, there is so much similarity. But it draws out sound from an instrument that needs more work to get sound than a violin. So I will start by saying that one of the things I learned when I studied with Mr. McInnes was lots of things about bow distribution, but he would always say, if I had a problem with a shift, he'd very often say, do that in a different part of the bow. He'd say, go to the tip or something. And I would suddenly find that I had success. He'd go, see, there you go. I always wondered about that. And I thought that was clever. And so when I had troubles, I would try doing things like that. But there were times I found that I couldn't replicate the success. So I started thinking about it a little bit more. And over time, and I mean over time, and teaching students, particularly, not just my own performances, I started to realize that there are a lot of exercises one can do for left hand accuracy, thousands of them, lots of etude books, Sevcik, and so on. But how was it that when I do a first to third position shift, which we all consider pretty easy, sometimes you're not successful? How is that? Why is such a simple shift so sometimes elusive? And I started to find that when I was in the middle of the bow, I'd always have success. I thought, well, you can't do shifts in the middle of the bow all the time. You can sometimes, but depending on the kind of phrase you're playing, it might be a very long, drawn out phrase. You might find yourself at the end of the bow. So you don't have a choice to shift in the middle. So maybe you should shift. Maybe you have no choice but to shift at the tip. And likewise on an up bow, sometimes you might find that you can't be in the middle for a shift. You find yourself down here. So I started to realize that there were 5 regions of the bow that you can use for shifting. And that is the frog, the lower half, the middle, the upper half, and the tip. And why do those work? And the reason they work is because you're bowing on the right-hand side of your body and you're fingering on the left-hand side. So you're put together down the middle. You're, as we say, bisymmetrically divided. You're symmetrical long ways. And when you go out from the body, you're going from left to right and then right to left, depending on the bow stroke you do. So this is one side of the body doing something very different than the other side of the body. So when you find these places, these are essentially essential balance points in the bow. And when you're in the right part of the bow, depending on the way you're using the bow, there's a logical place for every shift to happen, and it balances you evenly, or as evenly as you can, between the right and the left of your body. And knowing where to be, so if you do Kreutzer first etude, you do the shift up here in the upper half if you start on a down bow. If you start at the tip, there, that's the lower half. That's where that shift will happen. And then you go to the frog. Then you do an upper half shift again, assuming you start on the down bow. Tip. Lower half, frog, upper half, tip. And so that's a great etude right there for learning bow distribution. And you've got to make sure that you arrive in the particular zone that is the logical place for the shift at the very same moment that the hand shifts. Now, I'm not saying that's the only way to think about left-hand technique, but as I started to embrace the Franco-Belgian way, I realized that there was a direct correlation between bow usage and left-hand accuracy. And very often, in the past, I'd had teachers ask me to drill a shift, drill a shift, drill a shift, drill a shift. And every time I drill the shift, eventually I'd get the shift. And then they'd say, good, see, excellent. But I always walked away from that experience thinking, can I do that again? Can I do that again? And when I found that I couldn't, that was when my mind started to wonder, why did I make that shift work? Why was that one time successful? And as I started to think about it, well, I realized there was this component to it. Now, I've since talked about this with violinists that I value, and one of my colleagues who studied with the great Dorothy DeLay, he said, oh, she kept talking about all these regions of the bow that you need to get good at being in for technical events. She didn't say it the same way. So it's not that I discovered this. It was already known, or to some degree, it's been understood. But I think on the viola, which is a bigger instrument and less intuitive physically than a violin, having knowledge of this is really helpful for shifts. And, you know, I'd prefer you to drill a region in the bow and find that you are nailing that shift than just drill the left hand by itself. The two have to go together. It's like language, it's like speaking a language. You can learn all the rules of grammar, but eventually you've got to speak it. And you're going to make a lot of mistakes when you speak a foreign language. But if you don't actually get speaking, then you'll never really understand the language. And so I consider this thinking about the bow to be akin to really properly learning how to speak the language of technique. And Primrose said 80% of playing the viola is in the bow. Now, over time and experimentation, I've come to feel the same way, that he's completely correct.
That's awesome. Well, excuse me. There are some questions in the chats that I want to cover, but before that, I just wanted to ask one thing. Still about the bow, which is, do you also, of course, you have many different situations, but do you also try to relate the speed of the bow with the speed of the shift itself?
Yes.
Or this?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Because we do different things between both hands, it's very important where we have the chance is to do similar things. In fact, because we're put together, our nervous system is mirror image. So the nerves that operate my left hand, the nerves that operate my right hand are mirror image. So when I do this kind of thing with my fingers, here I'm doing 4, 3, 2, 1 thumb. It's so natural, it's so easy to think about doing that. I don't think at all. It's all intuitive. Also, if I want to go thumb 1, 2, 3, 4, it's very, very, very easy. Now, what's not easy is if I do 4, 3, 2, 1 thumb and thumb 1, 2, 3, 4, I have to think about that because that goes against the wiring of my nervous system. This is much so theoretically, if I had an injury and I had to change my playing to the other side, do you realize that all the fingerings that I know for every work that I teach and that I play would come out the same in the other hand? Where you use a fourth finger, use a fourth finger. Where you use a first finger, use a first finger. It's mirror image. It feels weird because my body hasn't been used to the twists and the turns, but that's not lost. That's retained. That's amazing. So when you do a shift, exactly, if you, for instance, are shifting on a bow change, and then you change the bow quickly, then you're automatically going to do a quick shift like that. You can't almost control it. It's hardwired into your nervous system. So you have to try, as I often say to my students, you need to shift in the speed of the piece, or in the tempo, or in the pulse. You know, what's the fundamental pulse? You know, are you shifting? What is the speed of the shift? Oh, it's on a 16th note. All right. So it's a 16th note shift in the tempo of a 16th note, or the tempo of an 8th note, or whatever it is. So in general, when people shift, they tend to go too fast. But again, they're not just too fast because this is too fast. It's often too fast because the bow change is too fast. Or they're not getting to the right zone in the bow at the right moment. So there's a disparity between left and right. And so as you teach people to do that, you find that their accuracy goes up and the naturalness in which they play goes up. So yes, there's definitely a correlation between bow speed, bow change speed, bow weight. If the weight of the bow is the wrong for the moment that you're playing, sometimes you need to be lighter in the bow let the hand glide. Sometimes you need to support tonally so the hand doesn't feel that it needs to jump in and make tone. The hand makes the notes, the bow makes the tone. But when you confuse the roles, where the left hand pinches or wants to, or if the bow is not giving proper tone at that moment for the music, the left hand tends to pinch because it wants to put the tone back in. Left hand is not good at tone. Bow is good at tone. Left hand is good at notes. So I tend to also tell people to govern your bow change. Sorry, govern your left hand by how you use your bow, both in terms of zoning the bow, both in terms of bow change, bow weight, and bow speed. And those all together allow your technique to be comprehensive between both hands.
That's amazing. I'm totally gonna practice Sevchik Opus 8 after this live. Seriously. So we have some questions from the chat that were made by some of the main teachers from Brazil. Actually, we have like some of the really good teachers. We call them the Avengers from Brazil.
The Avengers?
The Avengers from the viola in Brazil. So Brenda's gonna be able to put on the screen one of the first questions.
Oh, the role of each finger on the bow. Sure. Out of Franco-Belgian technique, all fingers. I mean, so everyone. I'm talking about Franco-Belgian because that's my school. Obviously, other schools exist, and there are other philosophies about bow hold. But for me, each finger, every last one of them, has a role of creating weight. You know, the old Russian school for violinists, the weight is more concentrated through the first finger. Here, at least in certain positions in a bow stroke, all fingers are adding weight their own way. The fourth finger sits on the top. These fingers are sitting on the top of the bow that way. If you lift the hand too high, now the only way you can get weight is through pressing with the thumb and opposing with the fingers. But if you have your fingers lower on the bow, then they're sitting on the top of the stick, and then they're all imparting their own weight into the stroke, which I think is very good in viola playing because it draws sound out of the strings, which, as we know, don't speak as quickly as a violin. Primrose had a little trick, which I'll see if I can do in front of a computer. He would hold the bow without, I don't know whether you can see, oh, it's the wrong way, without the thumb. And he'd even hold the bow without the first finger. Do you see that? And he maintained that what you really do is that these fingers, these middle fingers here, they pull in towards the stick. And the fourth finger sits on the inside and pushes out. So if these fingers pull in and this pushes out, you're wedging the bow in the hand. And so the thumb is more of a supporting finger. The stick just sits on the thumb. And the first finger does, at some point in time, does very little. And at other points, like on an up bow, you lean in on the up bow. You're not lifting like the Russian school, you're leaning in. And the leaning in is what gives power on your up bow. But as you get to the bow change, and you follow through with the fingers, oh, it's hard on the screen. There we are. You follow through with the fingers, then the first finger is actually not doing very much at this point. That's the beginning of the down bow. And then you go the other direction. And in fact, the fourth finger is taking a lot of the lead that the first finger just took. So then you do your down bow. And then as you get to the end of the down bow, you start to lean into the first finger again, readying it to do the up bow and then give the power on the upstroke. So the thing that Primrose would talk about with this idea here of wedging the fingers, like you're using Chinese chopsticks, it means that you've got the ability to pivot forward when you need to on the first finger, and then you pivot the other way when you've got the fourth finger. and then this becomes fairly unimportant. But in the middle of the bow, when you're between strokes, then you look more like this, and then you're imparting a lot of independent weight. But one of the things that this kind of technique implies is that the thumb is relaxed. The thumb isn't straightening. It's not straightening like that. It's more bent. There'll be a period of time when it might straighten at the end of a downstroke. But we've got to remember that when you look at the anatomy of a thumb, that's a bent thumb. Now, it doesn't look bent. People think that's a bent thumb. Well, that's a very bent thumb because the anatomy of the thumb. This is actually still a bent thumb. This is a straight thumb. But you can see how my thumb bends the other way, and most people's do. So that's still a bent thumb. You want that more than you want this. And frankly, I feel I prefer less of this. I think there's a tension also. So you need to be in a slightly more neutral position. And doing it the way Primrose talks about pulling in, that means that the thumb really is a very natural. There. It looks, everything's mirror image on this screen. Sorry, everybody. But it looks more like that. And if you think about that, that's very much looks like your hand would be if it was resting by your side. So that's in general how I see the roles of the fingers.
That's awesome. We have another question from that same person, and Bruno is going to put here on the screen.
Yep. It's funny. I agree with you about the frog. That, I mean, again, many different schools of thought on bow change, but in mine, there it is. You start using the fourth finger to push the bow forward to the moment where there's no more bow left to push, and then you go the other way. And then as you go halfway through the stroke, you start, as I say, to lean in about the middle of the bow with the first finger to anticipate getting to the tip of the bow. I find at this point it's just incredibly easy to go the other way and do nothing with the hand. I find the biggest problem is down at the frog and the follow through. At the tip, it's so very easy. Once you've done all this and your hand looks like that, you just go, for me, the other way. And then you reverse or undo what you've just been doing, and eventually you turn into the bow change like that. Again, that's my training. That's how I do it. There are millions of different people that do different things and sound just great. But for me, that's the biggest challenge is down here. Once you master this, I feel that the tip of the bow becomes a far easier thing to do, and the bow change. And it's partially because the tip of the bow is lighter, so you don't have as many weights. And once you get to the frog, there's so many weights, and you have to suspend the weight somewhat at the frog so that you don't force the sound too much. But at the tip, the thing you have to do there is add a little more weight, which is why I lean in on the first finger towards the tip and the beginning of the up bow, because that's where you need the volume because it's weaker. But because of that, and it's the weaker part of the bow weight-wise, I don't think you have anywhere as near as much trouble as you do at the frog. And students, I think, come to learn that.
Cool. The last question that we have from the chat so far is also going to be put on the screen by Bruna.
Oh, yeah. Good question. Well, again, I defer to Primrose speaking about Lionel Tertis, who, of course, was the first big solo player of the modern age. And Primrose says Tertis was the first violist, modern violist anyway, to understand that you do not finger the viola the same way as you finger the violin. And if Tertis was the first to understand that, Primrose was the first to turn it into a philosophy. And basically, Primrose would say, my old teacher said, The glory of the viola are the open strings. The C string is unique beyond all string instruments. I mean, it's such a unique tone. The G string compared to the violin is so much more resonant, as is the D string. The A string is certainly more resonant, but it also has its own somewhat pinched quality that you don't hear in the violin, but that in its own of itself is a unique sound. And that the further you go, you know, down your fingerboard, away from the open strings, particularly on the C string, Primrose felt there was a certain register after which on the C string, it just didn't sound resonant and ringing anymore. So, you know, he'd think probably like a B flat or a B natural third position, or you could be in other higher positions, but he didn't think it sounded much better past that point. Now there are exceptions. But then as you play higher on the G string, he felt you could play a little higher than you would have done on the C string. And then likewise on the D string, and then highest of all on the A string. And that's why the viola concerti he commissioned have the viola playing very high on the A string. But he also felt that when you finger, whatever position you're in, find a harmonic here or there, find an open string you can include in your finger patterns to allow a resonation note, so that it's not just a stopped note, that there may actually be a note here or there that rings. And then the other thing that Primrose did that I was taught in solo playing, and this I think changes a lot when you do orchestral and chamber playing to some degree, or should we say string quartet playing, as opposed to things like sextets, quintets, piano quartets, piano quintets, which are dealing with a lot more volume and often very soloistic parts for some of the violas. But he felt solo playing required you to think in odd numbered positions. So first, third, fifth, seventh, rather than even numbered positions of half, second, fourth, sixth. Because in general, that puts you onto more favorable fingers for vibrato, for tone production, in other words, for for ring, and that in the even numbered positions, you sometimes get into positions, fingerings that lock you. And the first finger, your best finger, some people feel it's your second, then your first, then your third, and then your fourth. And so these two are the absolute best, the middle two are the next best, and the last two are the worst. And combinations of those lock the hand. So odd numbered positions as a philosophy, and I've heard this a few different times in my life outside of the Primrose tradition. There was an incredible violist in Australia when I grew up. He was Hungarian. He was a refugee from Europe during the Second World War, and he became principal viola of the Sydney Symphony, but he was also the founder of Australian string teaching. It was he alone that created the School of Australian String Teaching that I was partially the inheritor of as a student. His name was Robert Pickler. Primrose knew Pickler. Primrose went to live in Australia at the end of his life. And Primrose said, according to my teacher, if Pickler had lived in North America or Europe, Primrose didn't feel he'd have had his own reputation like he had it, because Pickler was that good. Pickler was an analytical man, and he said, passed through one of my teachers at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, he said, in symphonic playing, you should play in first and third position until you can't. In other words, those are your go-to positions. And then when you have to go higher and harder, do so. But choose those as your default positions. So that's sort of a basic sort of summation of fingerings. But yes, I agree. Fingerings on viola don't operate the same way as violins. And the higher you go away from open strings, in general, the less beautiful the instrument sounds. The nearer you are, or the more you incorporate in open strings or harmonics in certain situations. So Primrose fingerings are full of those kinds of decisions. If you look at the editions that he has left us.
I'm sorry, could you just spell the name of the teacher?
Pickler, I'm saying it could be C-K-L-E-R, but it's, or I think it might have been P-I-K-L-E-R. Robert Pickler.
Pickler, Robert Pickler.
Yeah, he was Hungarian. I don't know that there's a lot of recording legacy. You know, people sometimes had careers without recordings in those days. But major legacy on Australian string teaching. And my mother, as a concert pianist, played with him. And she said he was a very unforgiving musician. Like she said, but there was one time I played a concerto and I knew how well I had done it. And that's the one time he came and complimented me on how I played. So he had a very high standard. I never met him. He was dead before I was a teenager. But I knew a lot of people that had studied with him, and I studied with a lot of teachers that had influences from him. So, but again, it's interesting that Primrose knew him, and that some of the things that Primrose was saying, fingering-wise, were things that Pickler was also saying. Yeah.
Great. So we would also like to know how do you understand the influence of tempo when phrasing?
Sorry, say again?
How do you understand the influence of tempo when phrasing? I mean, about rubato and...
Oh, so you're asking me... so I misunderstood your question.
Okay, so... I mean, how do you think about the tempo when you're doing a...
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, it depends on what you're playing. It depends on what you're playing, of course, because there are works of music that are very clear about changing tempo in places. But I tend to think many, you know, as a teacher now, I'm speaking, I tend to think students think changing tempo means you're being emotional. And there is a correlation between playing in time and playing in tune. There's a correlation between playing in time and accurate left-hand technique, shifting. There's a correlation about playing in time and having good bow-hand coordination. And when you play Bach, Bach is incredibly rhythmic. And so if you're going to take time in Bach, which you can do, you got to do it at a moment that really matters, a moment that's really going to say something special, and that will aid in the message that Bach is creating. If you are random in when you take liberties, then the composer's message sometimes can be ruined. And put it this way, rhythm, in another way, if I'm speaking to you now in English or any language, you speak with rhythms. Rhythms are part of speech. When you learn as a child how to speak, you listen to your mother's rhythms and you put sounds to her rhythms. And eventually you make words and can go from there. And rhythms are important to how you learn languages. And music is a language. And rhythm is important to how the language of music unfolds and makes its message heard. And so I feel that as a student particularly, it's important to learn how to play in time before you learn how to play out of time. When I speak a language, when I speak properly in my language, And I want to make a point that you will not forget. I will use my abilities to change rhythm and duration to make myself clear. We call that inflection. And that is the same in music. You use those changes of expectation that normally go with the rhythms of words or in music, the rhythms of the music, to create extra meaning. But you've got to be careful because you're in control of that meaning on behalf of the composer. So when you do that, you're becoming a dictator. You're becoming a dictator, and you better be a good dictator because you could then be dictating the wrong message. So I'm not saying one shouldn't take liberties with music. I take plenty, but I think in educating a younger player, it's important to understand that a lot of good things come from playing in time, including, some of the things we've talked about today. You're shifting, we already said, shifting in the tempo of the piece. If you're not playing in rhythm, your fingers will go down at the wrong duration. And when they go down the wrong duration, you play out of tune or you miss a shift. So rhythm has those benefits, especially in an earlier stage in somebody's development as a student. And as you get better and more confident, of course, that's exactly when you start to think about whether you would take a liberty. And of course, in things like Bach, he rarely tells you to take a liberty. You don't know. You have to work that out for yourself. When you come to later composers, they can be very, very explicit about those liberties. And of course, so you're learning a different culture every time you learn a different composer. You're learning what they valued. And there are moments when an interpreter is going to. I remember in my recording of my Shostakovich sonata with the London Symphony, my old teacher, he loved it, but he said, "Why did you take a liberty there?" And he said, "Because it's not written in the score." And I said, "I've lived with it so long, I just felt that was a place." And he said to me, "I wouldn't have done that." And I said, "Well, there you go." So at some point in time, it does come down to, this music doesn't come alive without you, and you've got to be careful, but sometimes you've got to believe that that's going to do the right thing. So that's where it becomes personal. But in the studying of music and the studying of technique, rhythm's really important. That's what I'd say.
Great. So Mateus is gonna practice his English, and also he wants to make some questions.
Sure.
How do you think breathing when you play?
When I play, in what way? What way? You mean like musically or technically or
I guess
both?
Technically speaking, how do you manage your breathing when you play?
Like breathing.
Breathing. The physical breathing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So we come back to something we started talking about, which was how we use the bow. And this is where I come back to my younger training as a singer. When you sing, you have to learn where to breathe. You run out of air. Now, a younger person will run out of air quicker because they have smaller lungs. But wherever you're at in your development as a singer, you have to learn where to breathe. And as you are singing words, it becomes clear eventually, here's a good place for a breath. And vocal teachers tell you, don't breathe there, breathe here. And wind players, of course, also have to think about this. And if you're a flute player, you run out of air much quicker than if you're an oboe or bassoonist. So breathing is a little different a skill depending on the wind instrument that you play. But in every case, singer, wind player, brass player, breathing matters. Now, string players, their breath is their bow. So when we run out of bow, we have a problem, because then there may be a change in the sound as we go the other direction. So that's why we work so hard at bow changes, to help hide that moment. So if we're not careful, a string player can sound like they're breathing every time they change the bow. By the same token, we can keep a sound, if we get abilities with the bow change, we can keep the illusion of sound going all the time, unlike a wind player. But when we phrase, we really need to think more like a singer or a wind player. So I tell a lot of my students to try and sing, even if they're not very good singers, or vocalize. You don't even need to use pitches. You can just speak the phrase. You know, the Brahms E flat sonata. Dee da dee dee da da dee da. Breathe. Da dee da da dee da. Breathe. Da dee da dee da da dee da dee 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 da 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 dee 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 da. Breathe. Now the next thing with breathing that I think of is you've got to know that when you do a down bow, there's more accent at the beginning of the stroke than at the end. And when you do an up bow, there's less accent at the beginning than at the end. And those two qualities of the bow directly correspond to breathing out and breathing in, exhaling and inhaling. And so when you bow, particularly in like classic repertoire, not romantic, where they try to sometimes confuse where a phrase ends and a new one begins, it's really important to think about where the main emphases are. So when I some students, I say, let's vocalize this music, meaning let's speak it as if we're just speaking words. So if you're thinking about Walton Concerto, that passage in about the second page, depending on the edition you use, has accents that the composer puts in. But if you vocalize it, you hear the places where there are emphasis in the music. I tell my student to put a pencil line on those emphases. And those are the things that matter. Just like when you speak a language, not every letter, we don't hear every letter. We hear the syllables. We hear how many syllables there are. So,
especially here in Texas, right?
Well, they have many syllables. But yeah, that's right. So that helps a student to know where a moment is important and when it is not. Also, in general, where you have those moments, they're likely to be on down bows. Many of these points of emphasis or a point of arrival, you know, even in Brahms E flat, dee da dee dee da da dee da. Those are two down bows. They don't have to be played on down bows, but that would be a logical place to have a bow change. And if you're not going to do a bow change there, you're still going to give me an emphasis as if there was one. So learning where emphasis and release is in music goes a long way to helping you decide how to bow. And once you work out where a down bow is going to be, at least in lyric playing, obviously in fast music, very, very fast music, it doesn't quite work like that. But when you're doing lyric playing, which we do a lot on viola, then it's good to know where those down bows go, because then it's easier to work out where up bows come after that. And then what I try to do in lyric playing is I try to be sure that as I get to that down bow, just before I do it, I breathe out. And just before the up bow, I breathe in. If you breathe out at the moment of down bow, there's a tension in your playing. If you breathe in at the moment of up bow, there's a tension in your playing. But if you work it that you're get just ahead of each bow change lyrically, then I feel you put breathing back into your music, and that naturalness comes into the way you phrase. Now, if you practice that enough, as you work music, as you're learning a piece of music, and that's why bowing a piece of music to me is one of the first things I do. It doesn't mean two different people won't see bowings a different way. But if you're looking broadly for where a main emphasis is, you're likely to breathe out at that moment. You're likely to have good breathing. And just like good shifting comes from being in the right part of the bow, good phrasing comes from understanding where to breathe. And good breathing for a string player often comes from the rightly placed down bow, which then allows you to know where an up bow goes. Again, in lyric, in fast passage work, it doesn't work like that. But that's broadly how I think. And the more you do it, the more you get intuitive, and you don't think as hard about it. You just know, I'm going to be doing a down bow here, and I'm going to be breathing out here. But that's something you have to learn, just like a singer learns where to breathe in a text. Hope that answers your question.
Matheus, quer fazer?
Ok. Se achei que ia anunciar.
Another question.
Ok. What's important for a good sound production?
Oh, well, that's the $6 million question on viola. So I don't know about you guys, but when I chose the viola, I chose it because I really loved the sound. And when I think about it, I loved the sound more than the violin, but I didn't know it until I had an opportunity to play the viola properly. But what I loved about it for me was that when I played it, I felt, I mean, it didn't look like this, but it felt like it was vibrating under my chin. It felt so, I felt like it was talking to me. It was telling me what it wanted me to do. And I didn't feel that way when I played on a violin. Now, obviously, violinists feel that way, but this spoke to me in a way that the violin didn't. And I think it was the deeper pitch. And I felt, for me personally, there was, the greater length in my arm not being small, that allowed me to, everything felt like it worked easier. It worked more logically. My skills worked better. So I think the first thing I want to say about tone is, you've got to fall in love with the tone of the instrument. And you're always told as a student of the viola, you need to give more bow weight. To some degree, I've spoken about that today already. And one of the things as a teacher I'm always looking for is, how is the student holding their bow? Also, how are they holding their viola? If you bring the viola across your body, but if you have a little bit more on the shoulder, you have more use of the bow. So you can immediately use gravity and get. And you get a different quality of tone. So one of the things that I think Primrose and many his disciples in their own way, would talk about is you've got to hold the viola a certain way to allow gravity and weights to do the work they should do naturally, to draw sound out of the instrument. You need to hold your bow arm a particular way. There are all kinds of rules that come from that tradition. He didn't like dropping the elbow too much like that. He wanted to have more of a line here. I think he felt that what this did was only allowed the weight of the hand to get tone, whereas here the whole arm is working to get tone. There are all kinds of things that school would talk about, but you can use the English words setup. Karen Tuttle, who also studied with Primrose, the great Karen Tuttle, she was asked at a masterclass I was present at, they said to her, if there was one thing that you would teach a viola student, one thing, what one thing would that be? And she said, setup. That's what she said. And in my training, my teacher would have said it his own way, but it was basically the same message. Stand properly, the way you place your feet, the way you stand on your feet, how far forward you lean, how far back you lean, how wide or narrow you have the viola, how you have your hand around the bow, how the elbow and wrist are related to each other. All of those in themselves, each one of those things changes your tone. It might change it that much, but then you add the next issue and the next issue and the next issue. But the main thing is to get the instrument vibrating freely. And the way you hold your body, the instrument and the bow, an infinite number of different factors within that determine the quality of your tone. As I said at the beginning, the Franco-Belgian bow grip has been very helpful in the Primrose tradition anyway, to help draw out sound from the instrument. So tone, I think the thing about being a good violist as opposed to being a good violinist is that a violist listens for that first up, because the viola should be bigger than it is. It's not the perfect tenor sound. It's a tenor alto hybrid. And if it was to be the proper tenor sound, it would be too big to be played, at least on the arm. So the viola has had to be a compromise between size and sound. And so when you play, it takes a lot of work to get sounding as pleasant quickly on a viola than it would on a violin, because you've got to always work against the size, your size also, the size of the player, the size of your hands. So it is a more unique experience to create tone on the viola. And I think it's really a lifelong enterprise. I don't stop thinking about tone production. It's not that you get to a point and you never think about it again. I might have a basic tone that I like every day, but there's a part of every day that I'm playing, I'm asking myself, do I like the tone I am producing right now? And once you stop doing that as a violist, you cease to sound good. It's something you do every day, and you never stop doing it. And then if you don't like the way you sound, the first thing I do is I look at myself in the mirror to watch my setup, to see, is there something I am doing wrong? Setup isn't something that you also can stop thinking about. The minute you stop thinking about your setup, is the minute that your tone is going to start to falter. So for me, tone and setup are two things that go together. And the other part of it is you've got to train your ear what good tone sounds like. You want the most overtones, you want the most ring, you want to be getting to the core of the sound. And that, of course, is why I think the Primrose tradition was so insistent on good bow technique, because I think he felt that that was the key. And if you look at the history of the viola, that people would play the viola thinking that it was just a big violin, very frequently didn't think about setup, bow hold, posture, and how uniquely different viola tone is than violin tone, and therefore continued to perpetuate the bad reputation that violas had at a certain point. And it was really the modern people like Tertis and Primrose and many others who said, no, it doesn't work like a violin. We have to rethink all the things that you would think about. It's basically like speaking Danish and Norwegian. They basically understand each other, but then they walk away from the conversation and you ask each person individually what the other person said, and they'd have a slightly different opinion. And playing violin and viola is like that. Then they're related, but they're not the same language. So that's how I'd explain tone.
That's awesome. So this is our second to last question, and Bruno is going to put on the screen because it came from the YouTube comments as well.
Yeah. Okay, so vibrato. So I don't know how other people learned vibrato, but I learned vibrato as a violinist. And I was told that it was an emotional response, and that you need to feel the need to do a vibrato, and sort of you will find out how to do it. You look at other people doing it, and you were like, oh, I wonder if I can do that. And you just sort of, where's my viola? And you just sort of did it. Now, when I was on the violin, eventually I learned how to do vibrato more or less that way. I wasn't given lessons on it. You could debate whether that was good or bad. I would be inclined to say it was initially good and then ultimately bad, because there is a truth to it being an emotional response to beautifying music. But when I came to the viola with the extra length that you needed on your arm, I found vibrato harder to do. And my first teacher in Australia, he was a German man who'd emigrated to Australia, and he was the principal viola of Sydney Symphony. And he's the one that taught me vibrato properly. And he felt that vibrato should be done from the wrist. Now, I've come since that point to disagree with that, because I know people who do it more from the elbow. And there's no rule. If you sound good, you sound good. He taught me to do a wrist vibrato. And I think that's my everyday vibrato that I do. I think one of the problems I had was how wide to make a vibrato. And the other problem with vibrato, of course, is if you vibrate above the pitch, then we perceive you as playing sharp. So really a good vibrato, you put your finger slightly below the pitch and vibrate up to the pitch. So then we hear you as playing in tune. So those are basic things, but the mechanism of vibrato, I mean, when I studied with Mr. McInnes, he had a rule that there were more or less 16 different kinds of vibrato. And he said, if you think about it on a graph, you have an x-axis and a y-axis kind of thing. On one axis, you have an elbow vibrato, a wrist vibrato, knuckle. You try to do it from the knuckles, and then from the finger. So that gets you different widths of vibrato, essentially. And then you have very fast. You can have the speeds. You can have medium. You have wide. You have very slow vibrato. And you add all of that up, that equals 16 different vibratos. You can have a wide wrist. You can have a narrow elbow. Some of those are not very usable vibratos, but they are, however, theoretical. So I think in general, I do a wrist. Many people do. It's not good or bad. It just works for me. But from there, I try to have different speeds, and you can play a fast vibrato, but it can be wide, which means that you're covering more pitch, but you're also doing it so fast that it doesn't feel wide. It just feels luscious. Sometimes you want to lower the profile of the finger so that you get more flesh over the note, which makes it a little more, into our ear, warm. So there are lots of rules. One of the things I learned was the other thing that's hard with vibrato is doing an even transfer of vibrato from finger to finger. And I used to do 10 minutes every day before I started playing, just without putting bow to string to do that. The other thing is I tried to do it in first position always is hardest for that because they're bigger leaps. So I'd do something like a D flat major scale, which big stretches across strings, or E major, big stretches, things like that, which put a lot of tension on the hand. Now, the Weymouth double stop etudes, if you know about them, they're really helpful for things like that. But I would do that. The other thing that I found that I did that some other people did too was I tended to think of vibrato as a back and forwards motion. But a colleague of mine helped me one day and said, look, do you ever think of it as an up and down motion? So that the finger is going up and down rather than back and forth. Now, really, that's not true. The finger goes back and forwards. But in my head, I started to do an exercise where I'd go to the harmonic and double the speed every two bows. And eventually, it converts into a lovely vibrato. And I did that every morning for about 5 minutes on different fingers. It didn't sound very nice. I always liked it when I got to the C. I get a decent harmonic. Eventually, it turns into a proper vibrato. So that was an exercise that meant a lot to me. It helped me to focus my vibrato more narrowly rather than making it too wide. And then when I felt that I had control over my vibrato that way, then it was easy to make it wider and more expressive when I wanted to. So that was a step that I went to that helped me with my vibrato. But whatever vibrato you do, if you feel that you do an arm vibrato really well, stick with it. Doesn't matter. Just learn to do different speeds, different widths, different focuses. You know, another thing I would think about is that there's a little electric current coming through my fingertips, so that when the finger goes onto the string, it's simply fulfilling an electric current. And it makes my vibrato a little bit more instant. The other thing, of course, is bow technique. The vibrato you've got to learn to coordinate a bow change with the finger change, and then keep the vibrato moving as you do that. It's easier when you do a slur, but it's sometimes harder when you do separate notes. So, but for me, vibrato, it does start out as a natural impulse, and then there are just a few exercises and things that I did that helped me to get the vibrato I like. And then one other thing you need to do once you feel you've got a good vibrato is you need to write out adjectives of emotions. You know, anxiety, amorous, excitement, things like that, or contentment. Here's contentment. And you think, what does contentment sound like? And you do it again. All right, now the next note that I want to use the word anxiety. And this one I want to be excitement. And each time I do that, I have a different speed, I cover a different width, and I have a different bow speed, and I have a different bow weight. And all of those things go together to create an emotion through sound and through the vibrato reacting. And so vibrato, as my first teacher always said, is an emotional response to the music. So once you've got a good everyday vibrato, to make sure you have variety in the vibrato, write out a list of adjectives, and every day play 3 or 4 of them. And on different fingers, in different positions, different strings, and you'll get very good at creating a variety of vibratos and different bows with different speeds and widths without you having to think too technically. And then that's when it becomes music, and that's the goal. So that's my answer to vibrato.
Awesome. So for the last question, which is something that we always ask in the end for every guest that we have, we actually created this to help and motivate violists because of the coronavirus situation. So
it's a great thing.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of people are not having lessons. A lot of people cannot have lessons because they don't have the access to the technology that they need. A lot of people are not playing in ensembles. A lot of people lost a lot of money with gigs. So it's hard sometimes to keep motivated in times like these. I know, like the United States has a lot of grants for artists reliefs, but I'm not sure about Brazil that much. So I wanted to ask you, what are your advices and suggestions for people to keep motivated and keep it going in times like these?
Well, there are so many things. Look, much has been taken from all of us, both in terms of money and access to, the live one-on-one culture that human culture that we have as musicians. So I appreciate what you're doing, and I said to my own students, much has been taken from us by this. But as I'm reminded, when much is taken, much is given in return. So what's given back to us? Well, one of the things that's given back to us is that music never goes away. You still got this. This still is your friend. It's still, you don't need electricity to play it. You don't need anything but you and it. And, there's nothing more beautiful than opening up a piece of music and playing it because that's what you're doing to give you emotional sustenance, and to you can play for other people in your near vicinity, your family, your very few friends if you're social distancing, but you can use technology to play for people. People are, if you've got it. But the most important thing is you can play for you. It's still there. Beautiful music is still there to be read and to be learned. And so what I did when I knew that I was not going to be able to have almost any festivals this summer is I went to my office. I got a lot of the major repertoire, not all of it, just enough. And I've got some stuff that I would like to learn myself that I hadn't yet learned in my career. So that's something I'm going to be doing for the rest of the summer. I'm going to make sure that my instrument and I are the truest of friends. And that's the beautiful thing about acoustic music, is you don't need technology. It's pre-industrial technology. So you can still be a musician, and you can still give. Not only, if you can't give to others, you can give to yourself. So that's the first thing I would tell people to do. The second thing I'd tell people to do is, here's an opportunity. Almost everyone has access to some recorded medium. Here's an opportunity to listen to as much music as you possibly can. Not only, in your area, your instrument, but outside of your area. Listen to the great, if it's a classical musician, the great classical art. Listen to the great composers, the greatest works of the greatest composers. Listen to something you don't know from one of the great composers. You're living in a time now where access to music far surpasses my access when I was growing up. What I would do is I would go to the classical radio station and I get this thing called a cassette and I put it into a tape player and I'd press record and I'd record stuff from the radio. But that was free. We think that free music is still is a modern thing. No, the radio is free. So you can always listen to the radio. If you can't get YouTube, you can listen to the radio. There's Spotify, there's Apple Music, there's all kinds of stuff. But I would make it my business to read, to listen to as much great music as I can. This is an opportunity outside of learning your instrument to learn music, just the great tradition that we are all inheritors of. And so, that's another thing. I would, if you have the ability to go online, you can also go and look at music that is free online, that maybe you want to learn and that you've never had the chance to. So you're living in a time when the access to, if not everything, you have access to more things than I ever did growing up. And it's so easy, I think, sometimes when you're doing your normal everyday life to forget that this is all around you. And so now that stuff has been taken away, realize that there's stuff right in front of you that is begging for your attention, even that said. And I think that's one of the things I would tell people. Much has been taken, indeed it has, but there's much in front of you that is there to be taken advantage of. And this could be a wonderful time in your life when you learn the beauty of doing that, and it'll also get your mind off all the other horrible things that are going on. I think that's what I'd say, exactly. Technology, we all have access to some technology if we don't have access to all technology. Does that make sense? Let me adjust my blinds. I'm finding that the setting sun, the sun has just changed. So I was getting a lot of sun on me. Anyway, that's what I would say.
Thank you. And also, thank you so much for being here and spending your time with us today and sharing so much knowledge. And so I just want to say thank you. It was very motivating and we are very grateful.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I want to also thank you all, those who have sent in questions and your own questions. They're all very fascinating questions. They were very enjoyable to answer and they were very well thought out. And one of the things that's really nice to see is young people thinking up such smart things to ask, because it means that you're really thinking about what it is to be a player. And I'm really excited about the questions I received today. So thank you. And I also want to thank you for your mission during a very difficult time to bring these things to others and proving, I think, my point that music is the great friend. It never fails you. It is always a friend to me in my hardest moments in my life. It's never failed me. The one thing that never did fail me was music. So I thank you for sort of more or less agreeing with me on that and bringing that to everybody right now, because that music beauty is the thing we need the very most right now. We need the eternal truths of music and beauty, and it's very encouraging to see you guys thinking about that thing.
Thank you.
Thank you for today.
Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye. It's been a
So
pleasure.
much.
So
Obrigado. Diga, Bruna.
Obrigado.
before we say goodbye, I also want
Oh,
to,
I think Bruna has.
yeah, I want to show you some comments from the YouTube. Some
Oh, good. I'm glad you played for him. Yeah. He's retired now, so he's not teaching or playing anymore. But I spoke to him yesterday.
yeah, so they are also saying thank you, and
Thank
also
you.
also Leonardo was here also.
Oh, Leonardo. Good to see you again. Excellent.
Yeah.
You know, for those of you who know Gramado, I loved being there this year. It was so much fun. It seems so long ago now.
Yeah.
I remember thinking when I was in the hotel there, I'm thinking, this coronavirus thing's looking a little bad. Hope it doesn't come to America. And it did. And you're probably thinking, hope it doesn't come to Brazil, and then it did. So, but at the time, it seemed like it was this little tiny thing. Yeah. Well, so, but I had such a lovely time in Brazil. It was such a beautiful place, and lovely people. So hopefully I get to meet Brazilians again sooner than later. All right, everyone. Should I?
Israel, Bruna, só um desafio rapidinho. Pode pedir para ele falar sigam as violas em português. Sigam as violas em português. Um desafio ele falar sigam as violas.
Mateus is asking you to say a few words in Portuguese, if you wouldn't mind.
No, I would say to you, boa noite.
But
Boa noite. Yeah. It's no. I have terrible Portuguese. Portuguese is if I come back to Brazil, I'll be making sure I learn it, because that's the one thing that I have some Italian, I have some French, I do not have Portuguese.
yeah, but very good.
Anyway, should I press leave studio now? Is that what I do?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Right.
Again, thank you very much. I really
Thank you.
enjoyed it, guys. It was a lovely time.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
É isso aí, moçada.
Obrigada, pessoal.
Obrigado.
Esqueci de mostrar outro comentário ali do Daniel. Mas valeu, pessoal. Obrigada por todo mundo que estava assistindo aí. O pessoal de sempre, né? A Sônia, todo mundo.
Detalhe que quando ele disse que ele gostou muito do Brasil, que ele quis dizer que ele gostou muito do Rio Grande do Sul, né? Que é de onde eu venho. Só um detalhe, só queria dizer isso.
É isso aí, valeu, galera. Nem tinha visto todos os comentários aqui, eu acho.
E fiquem ligados, porque na quarta-feira, às 9 horas no horário de Brasília, nós teremos Brad Doibner.
Isso
É
aí.
quarta?
É quarta. Às 9? Às 9, Matheus? Tá lá no Instagram também.
Tchau, pessoal. Boa noite.
Falou!
Tchau, tchau.